It is my pleasure to welcome you to another event of this semester's series, Point Counterpoint. The central topic that concerns us is politics and poetry. My name is Ilan Stavans. This is an effort to understand how thinkers, artists, poets, activists think, how they've come to think the way they do, and to allow them to speak to us directly. The Point Counterpoint series emerged in 2016 in response to a sense of disjointment, of fracture that took place in many colleges and universities nationwide, where we felt, many of us, that the country had broken apart, or at least there was an abyss in the center, and that the left didn't listen to the right and the right didn't listen to the left. And the task was to be able to understand those that think differently and that represent something that is not exactly how we see ourselves. The series is made possible by the Seminars on Opposing Views Fund, established by the members of the class of 1970 at Amherst College, with continuing support from individual alumni and parents. This year, we have had a stellar lineup. We started with David Brooks of the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, Jericho Brown. After that, we had a wonderful discussion on the relationship between Robert Frost and President John F. Kennedy by biographers Fred Loggeval from Harvard and Jay Perini from Middlebury College. Today, we have US Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. And next week, I invite everybody to come Thursday at 7 p.m. for a conversation with sociolinguist John McWhorter on his about to be published new book called 7 Nasty Words. What is the nature of offensive language? What role does offensive language play? How is it used? How does it change over time? And are different groups entitled to different languages as things get transformed? And after that, at the end of April, we're going to have the editor of the Washington Post, a recently retired Marty Baron, also be in conversation with us. I want to thank, before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I want to thank my colleagues, Christina Ledoux and Victoria Nardone, who have been instrumental in the technical and the publicity side of this series, and who are behind the screen, but very much essential for this to take place. It is my enormous honor to introduce and to be in conversation with Joy Harjo. She is an internationally known award-winning poet, writer, performer, and saxophone player of the Mvskoke Creek Nation, and was appointed the 23rd United States Poet Laureate in 2019, a position that has been renewed twice more, and it lasts until April 2022, where hopefully there's going to be a big event at the Library of Congress where the position originates and from which it is managed. She is the author of many books of poetry, including, and some of them not only are wonderful books, but have terrific titles: The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, What Moon Drove Me to This, A Map to the Next World, and rather recently, An American Sunrise, a book about which we will be talking. She is also the author of the memoir Crazy Brave, in the anthology When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Song Came Through, a northern anthology of Native Nations poetry. Aside from this, she is the creator of many musical albums, one just recently released called, again, a beautiful title, I Pray for My enemies. Um, Joy, it's wonderful to have you around, and I want to ask you a number of questions in a number of directions. And I want to start with a question of what does it entail to be the poet laureate? I understand the distinction, but I am interested in finding out if your writing life and your creative life as a musician have changed because of the responsibility that comes with representing whatever it is that you represent.
Well, first of all, there's really not a job description per se. And I was told that every poet laureate makes every one of us is different. So we make our own, we meet, there's an orientation and start developing, are we going to have a project or not? What, is it, maybe some people don't want to have a project because essentially it's an honorary position. So, of course, I had several projects in mind, and we can talk about the project later, my project. But I'm essentially doing what I've always done, except with a lot more visibility, so to speak. I have been traveling around the country and the world since I started writing as an undergraduate at the University of New Mexico, and writing poetry, performing. And then when I was almost 40, I started playing saxophone and then started adding music to some of my performances. But I remember when, before the position was announced, I called Tracy K. Smith and said, help. Yeah, yes. But I wanted to know, and bottom line is like, hang in there. I guess there's been a lot because of the visibility. There's a lot asked by the public. There's a lot asked from from there's a lot asked of the poet laureate, U.S. poet laureate. And I asked her, did you get any writing done? She said, I got one poem written during, she had 2 years too. She did 2 years of and wonderful, wonderful U.S. poet laureate. And she had one poem done. And I remember thinking, okay, well, but then we had the pandemic hit, which was one reason the poet laureate position was extended for a year, because there's been a year where we've all pretty much been under quarantine, the whole world, uh, except Oklahoma. But everyone has been in quarantine and shut down, which has shifted. I mean, it's been an immense shift in our in thinking of humans and humans' place in the world, and disease and connection. We realize how absolutely we are connected with everyone in the world. I mean, think of it, a pandemic that is touching everyone. So during this time, I would have been traveling every week through this year, almost every week. And so this time gave me time, it gave a tremendous pause. And for me, I went inside. It gave me the space to go inside. And I finished 3 projects and wrote a memoir, finished another Norton anthology called Living Nations, Living Words, that will be of contemporary Native poets, and a new music album.
Does it feel then as if you are grateful to the pandemic in spite of all the alienation and the distancing and the illness that you talk about, grateful for the reprieve, the capacity to look inwards, the more time that you have for yourself?
Well, that's not the only element, of course. There's the death and destruction. In our Mvskoke Creek Nation, we lost so many culture bearers, and the culture bearers, those people who know essentially the poetry of our language, the speakers, those who have carried the culture close to home and close to have maintained it. We lost several of those people who set the standard, cultural standards, and of our tribal nation. And that's not just, that's everywhere in this country. That happened for many of us in indigenous cultures, because um, comparatively we suffered often twice as much as some people from deaths in the pandemic.
The pandemic, as you mentioned, has hit tragically all walks of life. And of course, it has also hit populations of color and Native Americans in Latin America, where I come from. The indigenous population has been also affected terribly. And I'd love to, when the poet or the spokesperson or the guardian of a nation, of an indigenous nation dies, how do you see the loss? What is it that is dying? The memory of that nation?
It's a part of memory. It's people who carry, because so much is carried orally.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the people who carry the basically libraries. They
Mm-hmm.
they carry song libraries, or they carry libraries of our traditional knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that aren't written in books. And there's a reason they're not written in books, because they don't necessarily belong in those spaces. Books are a certain kind of space that don't always have a direct relevance to our indigenous culture, even though, of course, most of us have been educated uh, we have American educations. A lot of people go home after that and run kind of along different tracks. But these, when I say culture bearers, these are people who, have maintained, even, alongside of being down the road from Walmart, or all of this other that we negotiate and navigate just like many other peoples. But they're the people who hold what it means to be Muskogee Creek in the utmost, those root teachings.
I would love for you to reflect, Joy, on the maybe parallel, but I don't know, life of oral poetry and written poetry among Native Americans today. Is the oral tradition in poetry a vital, vigorous one? Has the written word mostly taken over? I know you produce these wonderful anthologies that Norton has been bringing out, and we see the poems on the page. Is oral poetry still very much part of the culture?
We're all dealing with how English is, and written language has pretty much taken over most of the day-to-day expression. But with the Muskogee Creek people, I think we have about 40% Muskogee literacy, which is pretty high, but it can't stay that way long without major efforts. I've in Hawaii, the Hawaiian language, I know they've had great success with their immersion schools, just like they modeled their programs on the Maori. But I think most poetry, if you look at all the poetry in the world, that I would guess that most of it is oral, or occurs in oral forms, often with music, sometimes oratory, you know, otherwise, poetry, just poetry, and less of it is written in books. But I remember I was a student. I went to high school at an Indian school. It was a Bureau of Indian Affairs school then, called the Institute of American Indian Arts. And now it's a full-blown arts college in Santa Fe. But I remember in the late 60s, we had an incredible arts education. Our academics was very lacking. And but here was this incredible arts education, and then we had the military terms, and that colonized sense of, okay, of militarizing interactions with Native people. And we were not, even in the late 60s, we weren't allowed to speak our native languages. I remember being in an English class in which we were being taught out of fourth grade readers, which was very, very boring for teenagers who wound up being at the cutting edge of American art, contemporary art. And so it was very boring. I remember now when I look back and look at the faces of the other children or young people in the classroom, everybody was within a generation of orality in the 60s, a generation or two. And that was so present in the notes we passed to each other, while we were being taught about, reading out of fourth grade readers, and the stories that people told, and the way the students loved language and orality, and were sarcastic, ironic, and there was such a contrast with how English came down upon us, and the experience of ourselves using English outside of that, and also people expressing, in their native languages.
Is there today a poetry emerging from the Native American nations that is not in English and that travels beyond the individual nation to other nations, and sometimes it's even translated? Or much of the poetry that is coming out, because of the influence of English, because of the influence of American education, of acculturation and assimilation, is now done in English?
English allows us to speak across language lines. I mean, that's what's great about it. Yes, it was a tool of colonization, hence the name of my earlier anthology, an earlier anthology that Gloria Bird, who was also a student when I way back at that school, she and I edited, and is that, English, it was a tool of colonization, and we, in a somewhat a trade language, but at the same time, as a trade language, it enabled us to speak to each other and with each other, just as it does now, just as I'm speaking with you. Spanish, another language like that, French, even another language. So yes, there are people. There's a new anthology out. I think it's called Dene. What is the title of it? Anyway, it's Navajo or Dene literature, a new anthology, which is exciting. There are several people writing in Navajo language who or incorporate elements of Navajo language in their work. So it's pretty strong there. I know Rex Lee Jim often, I think he writes mostly in his language. I've noted that many Hawaiians, there's a lot of active creating in that language going on, but especially in music. I've noticed that a lot of my Mvskoke, which I know less of Mvskoke language than I do Navajo, because I lived out there for years and studied the language as I started writing poetry. And I think the influences in the early poetry is most of my language use has really been in songs and songwriting.
So when we communicate, you and I, and you communicate with others in English, do you get the sense, Joy, that you are living in translation? That this is a language that came to you, upon you, that arrived, in that there's another language in the background, or there's a language in the roots that palpitates and wants to emerge? What is your relationship with English in that sense? Is there a love-hate relationship with it?
It's what I know. And yet I think I came to poetry because I needed another language. I came to poetry because I needed a language that went beyond pass the salt, or how are you, or just the ordinary transactions of everyday living. I came to poetry because I wanted a sacred language, a language that was more the experiences that I had that there were no words for many of my dreams. Crazy Brave, at one point in one of its incarnations, was about twice as long as as the final published version, because of the dreams in it. So I cut out most of the dreams, and then I try to embed them so I don't sound so crazy. but but yeah, so English, so poetry to me becomes maybe another kind of language. It's sort of like, yeah, in we have a lot of in a lot of tribal languages, there's a kind of everyday language you use, and then there's a language that it's another level of the language that's used in ritual or those kinds of other kinds of transactions that are meant to place you in another kind of state of mind, so to speak.
I want to ask you one more thing about language here before I move on to another topic. Joy, I'm very interested in Spanglish, in the mixing of Spanish and English, and the fact that almost 60 million people in the United States speak this hybrid language that is neither one or the other, but a mestizo in between language. And I wonder if there's a similar phenomenon among the indigenous people, the Native Americans, of mixing the words or syntax or patterns of the original nation's language with English as a way maybe to reclaim certain space in a sentence, but also in the mind.
I don't know if it's done with the idea of reclamation, but I always remember Alarista when I started writing poetry. We were all
Sure.
running around together, Ricardo Sanchez and all of that. But there's certainly ways in different reservation cultures, depending on the part of the country and the tribal nation, there's certain ways that people incorporate or kind of ride an English with that is very particular expressions for different and even ways of speaking or accents that you won't hear it out in the world,
Yeah.
but it happens from the inside. And when I lived in Hawaii, I lived out there for 11 years, mostly because I loved it out there. I didn't have a job out there. I learned to race outrigger canoes, and then I got a job at UCLA, and I would commute. I would commute. That's when you could get a really cheap pass. You can't do that now. And I learned pidgin, the pidgin,
Right.
which I could speak. I didn't speak it to everybody, but I could speak, and I know a lot of the phrases, and those are an amalgamation of, it's been every culture's contributed to it. The Hawaiian language, Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese. Mhm.
You mentioned a little while ago dreams and something that might show up. Could you talk to me about your the type of dreams that you have, and have your dreams changed as years have gone by, and how much do you pay attention to your dreams? Is there an oracular element in your dreams that tells you how to write or what to do, that allows you to communicate with aspects of your ancestry or of yourself that day life doesn't? In general, just the role of dreams.
I think that my poetryscapes and the dreamscapes are very similar. What I love about poetry is how one of the major tools, or maybe one of the major elements, is the use of time, along with rhythm and the musical element, but even how you can layer time. That's major. That comes from dreams. I've been an avid dreamer since maybe we're in a dream right now. Sometimes I like to live like that and think, okay, I'm in a dream. I am in a dream, because I know at death it will be like a page. I've died many times in my dreams, and I know what happens. And it's like it's lifted, and you're standing there watching, thinking, okay, watching the story, and you watch it, and it dissolves. But since I don't even know where to start or if I should even speak about it. I do say a little bit in my new memoir, because I am looking back, and I have a kind of authority because I'm a great grandmother. That gives me, more authority in the world. But yes, I traveled. I was a dream traveler as an infant, and that's how that's how I could make sense of what didn't make sense in my life here. You know, emerging into this place, Tulsa, Oklahoma, with my parents, and the history here, the history of our peoples being moved here, and then how that gets played out in the in the political realm, and in the realm of being a native family, and so on. But my dreams took me all over the world, and I didn't have names for what I saw. I remember asking my mother about Nubia. She's like, um, we didn't this is before Google, and my mother was not someone to go to she was a songwriter, and she didn't go to the library and look at card catalogs. I'm the card catalog age. But I would ask questions like that because that's where I had been, and I had watched a whole scene come down with prisoners and how they imprisoned people and what things that were done. I would come back with all of these dreams from traveling all over the world with these stories. It turns out my grandmother was like that too. And I didn't know what to do with them. I remember thinking, okay. So I would draw. I was always drawing, and I would draw houses that I had seen and places. And for me, creating became a way of making a pathway between those realms and this realm, which could be a dream or a series of dreams. It became a pathway, kind of a pathway. I mean, I've had moments where I've had series of very intense dreams in other places, and I'm not often who I appear now. So they've taught me a lot. Some of them are oracular. I've had some of them with my eyes wide open, and but I think that's just part of being an artist. I think it's just part of being an artist, whatever kind of art you're involved in. It's because where does the stuff of our creation come from? There's the dreams of stones, there's the dreams of plants, there's the dreams of the earth herself, Igana Jaga. You know, there's the dreams of ancestors that are wound through our DNA that emerge, and that's how I think of them. It's kind of um, for me, the language of poetry is absolutely connected with 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 dreams. Even the word dreams doesn't sound like enough. Like we need another kind of word. Vision isn't it either, but another kind of word. And maybe there's a language that has that kind of word.
When you say, Joy, that time is different in this dream where you and I are in trapped, in the dreams where we escape at night, can you elaborate a bit? Is time in this dream, I don't know, linear and progressive or chronological, and the time in dreams moves differently?
Well, I think even here and now, there's different experiences of time. I mean, look at the way infants experience time. I remember experiencing time as an infant, and how deep and how wide, and a day was an eternity. And then, when you're a young child, everything is huge, it's immense, and you experience space. I guess you would include space in that experience with time, because they maybe they are in this reality, they're always connected in a very usually stable kind of manner. And then when you get a little older, and then when you're my age, it's quite speeded up. But the way I slow it down is it's speeded up even as you can slow it down with when you write, when you enter into the kind of space that you do creating. And what I love about creating, whether it's with improving with the saxophone and then making the space for the improv to happen, or writing poetry or writing a story, is I can't know where I'm going. There can be a kind of intent which can act like a rudder. Like I was asked to write a poem for to acknowledge the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre that happened here in May of 100 years ago. And so I went into the space to see what I would see, almost like a dream. And I didn't know where it was going to go.
When you write, because I want to go to your music, which I love how you put the two worlds together. And I want to ask you first, when you play the sax and jazz and the blues, you talk about jazz and blues in your writing. It seems to me what you just said is that when you sit down and write a poem, you don't know. This is what I got, but please correct me. You don't know where the poem is going to take you.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have the poem in your mind. You're letting yourself go as if you were opening a faucet or opening a door and then seeing where it's taking you. What is the process? Is there improvisation that is similar to music in the act and art of writing your poems?
Probably yes, and probably no. Yeah, that would make a good song. Because I say that I just go in there. I'm not always blind. I might have a form in mind. I'm always feeling rhythms. Probably with anything, it's rhythm for me that I'm just kind of following a kind of rhythm. And then there's been some kind of thought process that's been going on maybe for days. I keep notebooks. I write down quotes. I listen. And, so there's something that's usually building. And so I've been circling around it. Every piece is different. Some things just come upon me. Mm-hmm. And there they are. I mean, I revise. I'm always revising. And there it is. But they're all very different. As far as the idea of improving with words horrifies me. I admire those artists, those rap and word artists who can just lay down a rap, improv a rap. That to me, that is maybe because I don't know, but actually revision is kind of like it is kind of like improv, but not quite.
How so?
Well, you're listening. Mm-hmm. But then you're going back to, it would be like being able to stop an improv and go back and say, okay, I want to fix this moment. And that's different. Yeah.
How do you know, Joy, when a poem is finished, the process, in the process of revision? How far do you belabor a certain text? The text at one point surrender and say, I'm done? Do you get exhausted and say, I'm exhausted, therefore this piece is done? Or in the process of revising, do you polish and narrow or I don't know, sculpt in such a way that you hit the heart of whatever poem theme you are after, and you know that you've hit that heart?
It's like building a house or building a room. Or building several rooms of a structure. And so then, all the structural pieces are sound, they work. There are no extra words, no extra phrases. You've pulled out everything that doesn't work. And the other day it came to me, and I really liked how this felt, is like, it would be almost like you have this room here, and an extra word would be like a 2x4 just going across the middle, So no, you don't need that. You take it out. So you have that sound, everything moves right together. And then it kind of, you know it, you can feel it, and it's coherent. And every once in a while, even if something's published, I don't do it with everything, but especially ones that I perform a lot aloud, I shift. Sometimes I shift because speaking them or singing them or performing them, I hear how it can be even more refined.
So going back to the idea of the oral and the written, if a poem is written, you might still feel that it could be revised slightly.
definitely.
Not because it's published, it's finished.
Right. No, and usually, I mean, I don't labor over all of them like
Yeah.
that. It's just tweaking. It's tweaking usually.
Tell me, Joy, about the two sides, the musician and the poet. Do you find the music in your poems the same way you find the poetry in your songs? In other words, these two sides kind of a cross fertilize each other. Does something come to you in the form of music and you allow it to come to emerge that way, and something else comes to you in the form of a poem and you allow it to be born that way? Or how does it work?
It works all different kinds of ways. Sometimes it's like that. Sometimes it's a song. And I know it's a song. Poetry, I have another whole approach, although some poems become songs. That's why in conflict resolution, I have a lot of poems or songs, and I put in parentheses song, because there's a different approach. I think I did that once in one poem with an American Sunrise.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just, I'll have a rhythm track. I often start with rhythm tracks. And even with a poem, even if it's a rhythm track in my mind, is becomes kind of the structural, is often for me the structural element over which a poem is built. It may not be a European verse form, but it's a resonant structural form over which the poem accumulates and builds itself.
And when you work on a poem, on the revisions, you're also working on the music of that poem. Every poem has its own music.
That's right. And that's one thing I love about poetry is I feel like I'm making music or phrasing. Phrasing is so much a part of it too. And I think my attention to phrasing has become even more acute, since I learned to play sax, and then the sax took me back to singing and and phrasing. I can see that it's made its way into my poetry, like the poem. I love reading the poem, how to write a poem in a time of war, because then I can hear the saxophone phrasing in that poem.
Um, there's a poem of yours that I love. There are many poems of yours that I love, but one of them has become iconic, An American Sunrise. That has at the very end, I have the book with me, a line that is very powerful. 40 years later, and we still want justice. We are still America. We, and the word "we" plays out, rings through the poem in a variety of ways. And you have turned that into also a music piece. Um, we would love to hear it, but I'd love to also explain to us, if you can, how it went from a poem to the piece, if one started, the relationship between the two.
Okay. Yes, well, I had the poem, and there's music wound through it, and it's a form called Golden Shovel, invented by Terrence Hayes, that pays honor to Gwendolyn Brooks. So you'll hear the last word of each line in the original version, is if you read the last word of each line, you have a line of Gwendolyn Brooks poetry. And so my co-producer of the album, Barrett Martin, was releasing a kind of an ethnomusicological memoir of all these places he played and learned music and so on, and asked, "Did I need a song for the contemporary native section?" I said, "Okay." So I went through some recordings he and I had done. We were both musicians living in Albuquerque around the same time, and we went into his friend's studio and recorded a bunch of percussion drum tracks, and I played percussion and he was playing, and so I pulled out one of those tracks. I listened, and then I performed An American Sunrise, the poem over it with some of the voicings, and then laid down saxophone, and then I sent it to him and he laid down other parts. So when I was doing my new album, he wanted to redo the horn part. He wanted to redo, sorry, the drum part so he could differentiate, because I was using. So we went back. I kept the original voice, and then we added some layers to the voicing, and then I added a whole new sax part. And then we brought in his friend from Rich Robinson from the Black Crowes, did a really killer guitar guitar solo in it. But that's how we built this song up. Others are a little different.
Let's listen.
Okay, here we go. Hang on. An American Sunrise. We were running out of breath as we ran to meet ourselves. We were surfacing the edge of our ancestors' fights and ready to strike. It was difficult to lose days in the Indian bar if you were straight. Easy if you played pool and drank to remember to forget. We made plans to be professional, and some of us could sing. Bebop-da-bop, 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 bop-bop, bop-bop, bop-bop. We drove to the edge of the mountains with a drum. We made sense of our beautiful crazed lives under the starry stars. We learned the devil from the Christians. We sang. We were the heathens, but needed to be saved from them. Thin chance. We knew we were all related in this story. A little gin will clarify the dark and make us all feel like dancing. Make us feel like dancing. Make us feel like dancing. Bebop, 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 bebop. With the music as I filled the jukebox with dimes in June. 40 years later, and we still want justice. 40 years later, and we still want justice. We are still America. Way-ah, hey-ah, way-ah, ho. Way-ah, hey-ah, way-ah, ho. Way-ah, hey-ah, way-ah, ho.
Joy, are you the first poet laureate that plays jazz?
I don't know. I know I played at my inaugural performance in DC in September, I was I brought a band out with me with a saxophone, and the but I was told that, well, Juan Felipe Herrera, I guess at one of his
Right.
performances had Los Lonely Boys. So,
That's
but I'm
right.
the only
I was
one.
thinking
I
that.
played music. I played, I had an instrument. And I
You did
played.
it yourself.
Yeah.
Playing jazz, several questions that I have connected with this. Do you hear yourself in dialogue with the poetic American and Native American tradition the same way you hear yourself in dialogue with the American jazz tradition? Do they both, you see yourself in both? You see yourself instead only mostly as a poet that plays jazz? How do you see yourself vis-a-vis these two traditions?
I had to see myself as the horn being the same thing as it's the same voice. It's the same voice as poetry. It's the same singing voice. I always wished I could sing like Aretha Franklin. So the horn gives me, the horn allows me to a kind of voice freedom that that it's just it's there's a kind of freedom, but is it as Colette said, what is it? Discipline is the key to freedom, or something like that. They're not quite that. And so there's a lot of discipline that goes into that at the same time. But it's the same voice. I American music, of course, the original American music, blues and jazz. My tribal nation was part of the origin story, and we've been left out of the origin story. So uh, when I play it, it's my version. A jazzer probably wouldn't call what I'm doing as jazz. It just sounds jazzy, but it's I always say, well, I'm playing native music. Of course, it's mostly African European elements, and our people were part of it. Congo Square was a Muskogean village of people.
It's very different to be in the solitude or in the loneliness. I don't know, there's two words sometimes play with each other or against each other when one is a poet or a writer, Joy, and when one is in a band where you have other instruments, other musicians. There is a collective effort there in the act and art of making music, in the type of music that you are giving us, that is different from the kind of re, retreat or the way the self is alone as a poet. Do you see them as very different, the act of creations of both of them?
Probably, although I tend to create my music kind of alone, and then I get to go out and play, and then I have a good time. I've been listening to Sun Ra lately and thinking I would love to start a kind of orchestra, that would really intensely include elements of native musics along with jazz, blues, and the rest of it. But it started messing around in my mind, that idea. But yes, the poet, to write poetry, it's the space is so interior, and the way that I learned to get over too much stage fright. I've learned that it's energy ultimately, was that I had to make the stage the place where I write poetry. I had to make it a kind of intimate space in which the creativity can happen, just like I've learned to do with interviews, or whatever, is to try to make it that kind of space so that I can move around creatively in that space, whether it's with a horn or with the call and response of Q&A, or it's I've had to learn to do that, because it was even to get up and read poetry as a young woman, that was difficult, to stand up and speak. you know it wasn't always the easiest thing to do, and then to add a horn, the horn just like you the horn makes is loud.
You say in the introduction to the anthology, when the light of the world was subdued, our songs came through, that there is no such thing as a Native American, and there's no such thing as a Native American language. I think I know what you are hinting at here, being a Latino and a Latin American, but I'd love for you to develop it. What does it mean that there's no such two things, a Native American and a Native American language?
We're over right now over 574 federally recognized tribal nations. There are other tribal nations that are genuine peoples, with a history and with roots that are state recognized. Many of the state recognized so-called native nations are not native nations, rather they're 501c3s of people who want to be natives. But there's a general term, Indians. I grew up with American Indians. Native American is a term that came out of the academy, the academic world, which often what's going on in the academic world that's called Native has nothing to do, essentially with indigenous communities.
Do you like that term, Joy?
No, I don't. I didn't like it. I still don't like it. And I understand there is a term needed for, to generally speak of everyone, but what's behind that is so many people think, well, we just speak, do you speak I remember getting this a lot. Do you speak Indian? It's like, wait a minute, there's Mvskoke language. I know some Navajo, I know some Hawaiian. There's over about a couple hundred, 200 or 300 native languages, indigenous languages. I use indigenous or native, or as in the anthology that's coming out of the Poet Laureate project, Living Nations, Living Words, an anthology of First Peoples poetry. But we go by our tribal, like Mvskoke Creek, although I've been at gatherings of traditional peoples from the ceremonial grounds, and I heard one elder talk about how, well, actually, that's not how we called ourselves. We called ourselves by our clan affiliations. Clan meaning a part of a group that's related in another kind of way.
So do you think that term Native American is falsifies what is trying to hint at, or it's inevitable that we would look for a generality or a generalization because of the nature of the multiplicity that the indigenous population represents?
I mean, it makes sense that people are looking for a term of generality, but generally, we have not been usually in the culture, in the layers of culture, in the layers of American cultural memory, which America is a very young country, is that, we were disappeared. Our stories, the stories of the founding of this country have been, falsified or disappeared because for this country to have, this country built itself, yes, on a foundation of ideals and democracy. Many of them borrowed from Iroquoian and Muskogean culture, our cultures, is that the reality of the narrative would have to include, yes, this country was very populated with people, human beings, not as the Popple Bulls proclaim, but as human beings who, yes, have culture, have astronomy. That is, no, the way the founding story is written, is that we were heathens and that we were not human beings, and therefore, or not Christian or human beings. Therefore, how could we, they were given dominion over us in the country. That's the narrative, the unspoken narrative that still continues to unwind in a country, in a narrative of America in which you do not see us as human beings. We are not seated at the table. To have Deb Haaland as the new Secretary of Interior is miraculous. That in a position that to have her in that kind of position.
Do you think, Joy, that history can be corrected? That the trail of tears, the silencing, the disappearing, the eclipsing, with effort, with education, with goodwill, can be turned around, or um, it's an inevitability that is here to stay?
I don't know how much you can change history. I know by my dreams tell me, yes, that you can. You can shift the story. You can go back. Even in conflict resolution, I have a whole piece in there that's a dream that happened, in which the guardian of the dream says you can go back and change the story. In reality, that dream came back around. In reality, in what went down behind that dream, we didn't, no matter what we did, we couldn't change. The story played itself out. And then maybe that's a thing. That's what I've been thinking, is that maybe there are larger resonant rings of the story that we cannot see, that are changing, and they change in different kinds of times, so that I don't know that we can correct history, but perhaps we reckon with it, and we reckon with the stories. And if you don't hide the stories, if you don't suppress, I think you see what happens in suppression. Suppression is a temporary device, politically, in a family. It's because what happens is it eventually, truth, you know, anything that is
Emerges.
suppressed, a history, it will emerge. And the way it usually emerges with pressure and suppression is violently. So it has to be more, it's sort of like what we're seeing, with the Black Lives Matter movement, is that the stories, the real story has to be, once the real story is out there, as painful as it is to acknowledge, and even to acknowledge all of our parts in it, at least we're free. We become free of it. Doesn't mean we're free of responsibility, but now we know what we're dealing with, which has probably been the terrible gift of the last years. Is, okay, we thought we had progressed, but apparently there is there are remnants, terrible remnants of hatred and so on, that have been around since the founding of the country, since the Civil War. They have not been reckoned with.
Because where you come from, and we're coming here to the close, and I'm appreciative from the bottom of my heart of the humility and the honesty and the eloquence with which you present always your ideas. Because of where you come from, because of who you represent, because of who you are, because of the history that is behind you and ahead of you, um, is it is it inevitable that you are a political poet? Do you consider yourself a political poet, or the politics just comes with it, but you're not deliberately thinking of yourself as such?
My poetry emerged as political poetry, because my poetry, I didn't start writing poetry. I was not a speaker. I sat in the back. I never said anything. I watched growing up. I saw violence growing up. I saw all kinds of things, but I never spoke much. And then I was a student at the University of New Mexico. I was pre-med. I'm still always in a healing mode, and with a minor in dance, and then went back into art. And because that's what I always did. I was always involved. I was always drawing, and I became part of, certainly the Kiva Club, which was a Native student club. Started out as a social a club for natives to gather socially, but we became uh, the central clearing, kind of the central the center for in Native rights movements. we became a center in the Southwest for Native rights movements because we could not be quiet about what we were seeing going on with the racism, the hatred, the violent acts against Indigenous peoples. And we knew that we could not, as students, we could not be silent. And my poetry started then. My poetry became, it was, I still don't, as I say in Poet Warrior, my new memoir, I still don't understand it. I love poetry. I love my mother's songwriting, but for it to emerge, one of the sparks of it was hearing Native poets for the first time, real poets. You know, James Welch, Simon Ortiz, very political poet, Leslie Silko, and then my voice, the poetry voice. I think it came and dragged me along and said, "Okay, you don't know how to listen, you don't know how to speak, and I'm going to teach you." And I could see my poetry voice spirit being, you know, the other ones standing around shaking their heads like you have a big job ahead of you. But my poetry came out of a deep regard and love for justice. And it came down through my ancestry. I am sixth generation. I thought it was seven, but it's sixth generation from a Nahua who fought Andrew Jackson against the illegal move of our peoples. And he wasn't the only one. He fought with the warriors, and the warriors can be men. And you know, the people took a stand, just like I think anybody else would if somebody was coming into your home and stealing your children and moving you out by gunpoint. You know, who wouldn't take a stand? And then we were moved illegally, and all kinds of stories in this country. So my poetry, it was almost like that urgent, there was an urgency that didn't start with me. You know, it came through my parents, it came through grandparents, and it's this need for the story to be told, and for to be sung, to be told, and for there to be some kind of reckoning with history.
My last question, and with it, I want to go back to many of the points that you have made, to that little girl that you were, that was silent and that listened before she found her voice, to the usurpation and the silencing of your people across history, the way that you play in individual poems with the music, and music is always also the space, the silence between one note and another, and in a poem, the space between a word and another. So I'd love to bring you back to your connection or relationship today, being so present, so distinguished, so vocal, so iconic, to silence at a time when many of us have spent a lot of time in our own homes, you know, the silence of our own conditions. How do you relate at this age, and after having traveled the way you have traveled creatively, to silence?
When you said silence, I almost got tears because there's so much that takes us away from that. But actually, that's one of the primary ingredients of poetry. Maybe that's the field in which the poetry, all poems exist, is in the field of silence, because it's in the field of silence that you can hear everything. You can hear the beginning of the world. You can hear the emergence of several worlds, and you can hear the nothing of nothing. And that's where we all come from.
Joy, I have loved spending time with you. And I have also heard a lot of voices in my head as you were speaking. I'm very thankful for myself and for everybody who joined us tonight for the opportunity of engaging you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Muchas gracias to you too for this opportunity and a chance to get to know you and to speak with you. And and the audience. Thank you. Mado.
Hasta luego.